I work the night shift in a building where nothing unexpected is supposed to happen, and because of that, most of my responsibility is not focused on reacting to incidents, but on verifying that the absence of incidents remains consistent across time, across systems, and across records that are designed to align even when no one is actively paying attention to them. The building remains operational throughout the night, not abandoned and not shut down, but left in a controlled state where lights stay on, systems continue to run, cameras remain active, and logs continue to populate regardless of whether anyone is physically present to witness what they record. Each shift begins with the same sequence of actions, including system authentication, confirmation of network stability, verification of camera availability, and validation of storage integrity, after which I remain seated and allow the feeds to stabilize into their assigned positions, waiting for the interfaces to stop refreshing and rearranging themselves so that the environment becomes predictable. That predictability is essential, because when you observe the same environment repeatedly, you stop noticing what is present and instead become aware of deviations, even when those deviations are small enough to be dismissed as irrelevant under normal circumstances. The first time I noticed the delay, it did not register as a problem, nor did it prompt any particular reaction, because delays of that magnitude occur naturally in distributed systems and typically resolve themselves without intervention. One camera feed, located in a service corridor on the third floor, appeared to lag behind the system clock by several seconds, not enough to trigger alerts, not enough to disrupt synchronization, and not enough to justify any action beyond a brief notation in the shift log, which I made without attaching interpretation or concern. What became noticeable later was not the existence of the delay itself, but the consistency with which it appeared. Because when the same discrepancy presents itself repeatedly in the same location, within the same temporal window, and with the same numerical characteristics, it stops behaving like random fluctuation and begins to resemble a stable condition that the system has already incorporated into its definition of normal operation. I did not question this immediately, because systems are designed to tolerate minor inconsistencies, and my role is not to correct them unless they escalate beyond acceptable parameters, but I did become aware that my expectation of encountering the delay began to precede my verification of it. Over several nights, I recorded the same offset without variation, always associated with the same corridor and always producing an occupancy entry that was not supported by the video feed, which continued to display an empty space illuminated by emergency lighting and interrupted only by architectural elements that never moved. I reviewed the footage manually, compared it against adjacent cameras, and confirmed that the discrepancy existed only in the logs, not in the image, a separation that was not inherently alarming but increasingly difficult to classify as accidental given its persistence and precision. At no point did the system register an error, and at no point did any alert threshold activate, which meant that from the system's perspective, nothing was wrong, and from an operational standpoint, nothing required escalation. The delay existed entirely within the space of acceptable variance, even as it continued to reproduce itself without deviation. After approximately 1 week, I expanded the scope of my review beyond the current logs and examined historical data, first looking back several weeks and then extending the search further into previous months, where I found that the same discrepancy had existed long before I noticed it and had gone unremarked because it never crossed any predefined boundary that would have required attention. The corridor designation remained consistent across changes in hardware and software, and the offset remained stable across updates, resets, and replacements that would normally introduce variation into any unrelated anomaly. At that point, I stopped attempting to identify a cause, not because a cause was impossible, but because the presence of a cause had become irrelevant to the way the system functioned. The data was not inconsistent, contradictory, or unstable. It was precise, repeatable, and accepted. Once that realization occurred, the discrepancy ceased to function as a question and instead became a condition. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it, not because it is disturbing or dramatic, but because it has defined boundaries that do not change, which makes it easier to anticipate than to ignore. I did not experience fear, confusion, or urgency, only recognition of a pattern that had been present all along. Following that recognition, my behavior adjusted gradually and without conscious decision, as routines tend to do when they accommodate known variables. I changed the way I reviewed the logs so that the appearance of the entry no longer interrupted the flow of my work, and I removed internal annotations that marked it as a potential issue, replacing them with a neutral classification that acknowledged its presence without assigning significance. When the expected time window approached, I no longer focused on the corresponding feed, not out of avoidance, but because there was no operational value in observing something that no longer conveyed new information. The corridor remained empty, the duration of the occupancy entry remained fixed, and no secondary patterns emerged that would have indicated escalation or resolution. Other guards rotated through the shift during my scheduled absences, and none of them mentioned the corridor, which was expected because the system never prompted them to notice it. Patterns only exist for those who observe them long enough and consistently enough for repetition to become visible. When I returned after several days away, the entry was present exactly where it should have been, unchanged by my absence and unaffected by the passage of time, which confirmed that its persistence was independent of observation. At some point near the end of a shift, I realized that I had stopped checking the duration of the entry altogether, not because it had ceased to matter, but because it had become fully predictable, and predictable elements require no verification once they have demonstrated consistency. The building remained quiet, the systems continued to function, and the cameras kept recording environments that did not change in any meaningful way, while the logs continued to reflect conditions that had already been accepted. I continued working in the same room, at the same desk, reviewing the same feeds, and recording the same information, with the understanding that not everything recorded is meant to be resolved, and not every repetition indicates progression. Nothing escalated, nothing corrected itself, and nothing required intervention. Nothing changed. That was the point.